to day 3 of the meeting. I think we had a good session yesterday, very wide-ranging on natural resources, looking at the description, recognition, and also having the first discussion on water. The focus today obviously shifts. We're moving on to discussing the revenue and transfer expenses projects, where we're very much at a different place. Yesterday, we're sort of thinking very broad-ranging in terms of the natural resources project, moving through to the consultation paper. Obviously, with revenue transfer expenses, we are, looking at the comments that we've already had on the exposure drafts and working out how we deal with them. And I think today we're building on the very good discussions we had about the principles in March and in the check-in in April in respect to transfer expenses. So looking at those core concepts of binding arrangements, enforceability, and then looking at a slightly different approach in terms of liability, and John's going to be supporting us on that with the links into the conceptual framework. In terms of today's discussion, obviously, there is the broader context in terms of, we know that a lot of transactions, revenue and transfer expense are not subject to binding arrangements. And at the moment, what we haven't got is the shell of the guidance so that you can see how those are going to be dealt with, but they will be there. And actually, one of the, in terms of the project plan, staff will be bringing the sort of shell of the draft final standards for ED71 and ED72 in September, so that we can start to see those building and in particular dropping in the text from the discussions today. So at that point in time, you will be able to see the text for those transactions not subject to binding arrangements. Obviously, we'll focus, those templates will be based on 71 and 72. We know we've got further discussions to have around present obligations versus performance obligations, and that we have the open question about one standard or two going forward. So, but in September, we'll focus on 71, which we've agreed will be the lead standard for revenue. So I think with that introduction, probably what I will do then, Eileen, is to introduce the item on binding arrangement.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so I've started sharing screen, so hopefully it has appeared. Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Thank you. So thank you, Chair, and hello, everyone, and thanks for your time and input today on revenue and transfer expenses. And thank you, Ian, for the introduction and the reminders of where we are with the project. So as you may recall, the IPSASB began discussing principle-related issues identified by ED respondents on revenue in March and transfer expenses in April. And these meetings did include some very robust and helpful discussions with feedback related to binding arrangements, distinguishing performance obligations, existence of a liability, as well as other topics. So the way we've structured today's session is actually in two parts. The first part is addressing the board instructions related to binding arrangements to fully round it out or close out that concept. The second part, which will also include two different papers, will comprise specific discussions related to how enforceability is exercised and the definition of a liability in the conceptual framework. And both of these discussions and decisions from these two papers will overall support our ongoing discussion on the existence of a liability on the revenue project, which will be continued in September. So the first part of the session is about confirming and presenting the binding arrangement concept. In March, the IPSASB confirmed that the concept of a binding arrangement continues to be integral for revenue accounting and reaffirmed that the principles associated with this concept, particularly around enforceability, are still appropriate, and that some revisions to guidance might be necessary to make sure we address some of the constituent comments that were noted and discussed in March. Now, one thing we wanted to highlight was that one of the instructions was about ensuring that the current definition is conceptually consistent with the use elsewhere in IPSAS. And this was based on reviewing the definition itself, not necessarily reviewing the term binding arrangement. And so our analysis has been focused specifically on the wording within the definitions themselves. So the first paper in the agenda item is about revenue specifically, and the second paper will be on the transfer expense side. So staff's process, which is detailed in the paper, identified two existing IPSAS definitions of binding arrangement, which were in IPSAS 32 and IPSAS 35, and one description, which was in IPSAS 31. And these are collated and presented in Appendix A. When we considered the principles in each of these identified definitions and descriptions, staff confirmed that the binding arrangement definition in 8070 and 8071 is conceptually consistent, i.e. consistent in principle, based on the fact that they all require rights and obligations, and these are enforceable rights and obligations, and it includes parties in plural, which essentially implies that it would be minimum two-way enforceability. We also considered past board discussions and decisions during the ED development stage that led to the current binding arrangement definition as used in ED 70 and 71, and we noted that the wording differences were based on these previous decisions, and the rationale for them are still appropriate and generally agreed upon by the constituents themselves. So based on the analysis and considering our discussions from March, staff is proposing that we retain the existing definition with some minor changes. As on the bottom part of this slide, we're proposing two changes. One is to add for the purposes of the standard at the beginning to clarify that it's specifically intended for the revenue standards. And this is the same approach that has been taken in the other IPSAS standards. The second minor change would be to remove the word both and put two or more to help explicitly emphasize that it would need to be at least minimum two-way enforceability. And that was based on the board analysis of responses in March, which confirmed that there may be binding arrangements where there are more than two parties where they each have enforceable rights and obligations. So there were two total recommendations for this paper. The first is regarding the retaining of the existing definition with the minor revisions we just highlighted on the last slide, as it is overall conceptually consistent with definitions elsewhere. The second recommendation is to showcase the changes, so the revisions or any additions to guidance in ED 70 and 71 on binding arrangements based on the decisions and the instructions provided by the board at the previous sessions. Now, because we wanted to give sufficient time today to discuss part 2, so the third and the fourth papers, staff is proposing that we first discuss the first recommendation, and then we move on to the second recommendation, but mainly focus on any significant concerns that board members have with the proposed guidance. And we would be happy to welcome any wording or editorial comments offline. And perhaps if we have time at the end of the session today, time permitting, we can come back to 6.3.1 and 6.3.2 to review the details of the proposed guidance itself. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Eileen, for that very clear introduction. If I can then open up for comments from members on the proposal in terms of the definition. So I've got Camira, then Patricia, then Adrienne.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Eileen, for the presentation. I agree with the recommendation in terms of the proposed minor change in the definition. What I'm not very convinced of is why do we need to have inconsistencies with the other definitions of binding arrangements in the other standards? And I saw that so even if conceptually they are consistent, there are just minor things in wording. For instance, I think in the IPSAS 35, that refers to enforceability, but in the IPSAS 32 and 31, they say similar rights and obligations. So instead of enforceable rights and obligations, I was wondering if as a result of this exposure draft, we can include in amendments to other IPSAS only to have a single definition for binding arrangements in all the standards, and instead of being personalizing for each standard a definition of binding arrangements. I think it doesn't make sense. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira, for that. I don't know whether staff want to pick that one up and address that right up front in terms of that consistency point, because I suspect other members will, will share that reaction. So I just think that might be helpful. Eileen or Ross, I don't know whether you want to come in on that one.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share, and thanks for your comment, Camira. I guess the one thing I would highlight is staff's discussions, and also with Ian before this session touched on that as well, because we kind of stepped back and said, if they are conceptually consistent, and yes, the wording is different, does it really need to be? I guess the first reaction is when each of these definitions or descriptions were created in the other IPSAS, was based on conscious decisions at the time, and even the definition in IPSAS 32 was actually echoed in a few of the other IPSAS as well, because it made sense to continue using the exact same definition. So similarly for the revenue project, there were good reasons for coming into it, and it may be a good consideration for future of whether we do want to make those updates. But I think we would have to really make the detailed analysis first to say, if we do change the wording word for word for the definition in all the other IPSAS, we need to make sure there isn't any potential implications. We don't expect there to be, given that it is conceptually consistent, but I think further analysis would need to be conducted just to confirm that that's the case.
Thanks, Eileen. Ross, did you want to just come in on, and then I'll go back to members?
Yeah, and just to echo Eileen's comments, and I can see the perspective when you say, well, why don't we just fix that issue and make them consistent? And to Eileen's point, that's a pretty big scope change, and we're already dealing with a lot of big issues on revenue. So I'd be a little concerned in trying to go and fix definitions where we're not hearing noise about from constituents causing them problems, just because we think we should, because we want to be consistent. It's not causing problems at the moment. I think we should focus on getting it right for revenue and what we need for these revenue standards. If we think we need to look at that down the line, we can log it as an issue and we can take it away once we complete revenue and then look at those definitions. But fixing these revenue definitions aren't really consequential amendments to those other standards. And we shouldn't assume that because we've had a discussion that it's going to work for that's the approach to take for constituents. And as Eileen said, it will take some analysis and some consideration, because we'll have to go back and look at those specific transactions and the weight of the wording the boards put behind those different definitions, where it's already agreed once to have two different definitions in the standards. So it's, conceptually, I can see the view that let's just fix it, but it's probably not as simple as just wording changes. We do have to go back and look at it. And at the moment, I think the better focus of the board's time is getting the revenue standards right. So that's why the recommendation is to keep them inconsistent at the moment, even if it does appear to be minor changes on the surface.
Okay, thanks, Ross. I think that's very helpful. So the discussion we're having at the moment is around the definition that's right for the revenue standards. But I think, reflecting Ross's comments, I think we certainly note that this does give us the issue around inconsistency, and we may want to pick that up at a future point once we finalise the revenue guidance. So thanks for kicking us off with that, Camira. So I think, leaving that point on one side for now, then what we're looking at is whether members support the proposed changes to the definition for this standard or not. So with that, I go back to Patricia, and then I've got Adrienne, and then David, Lucy, and Mike, sorry. So Patricia.
Yes, thank you. My question is not related to the definition itself, but the following text in this section 6.3.1.
Can we pick your comments up at that stage, Patricia? Because I want to just focus just on the discussion on the definition at this stage. We will come back to the text.
Yes, but it's not wording only. It's in my view, it's in relation to principles. Because the text presents the definition and explanation about the definition. I think the explanation about the definition it's not coherent. But
I'd like to get the definition right, and then we can focus on the explanation, if that's okay. Because otherwise I can't keep we're going to go all kinds of different places in the discussion. So if you're okay to hold that till we've got a definition, okay. And then we can talk about how it's.
Okay, I agree.
Okay. So if I can go to Adrienne and then David next.
So my question is, do we really need to insert for the purposes of this standard? Because I take the point that we're not going to resolve all the inconsistencies now, but the important work that staff has done is to check that there's no conceptual inconsistency. And so when I see for the purposes of this standard, I think we're just sowing doubt in people's mind about conceptual consistency across standards. And in fact, if there isn't any, then don't draw attention to it. Do we really need for the purposes of this standard to be inserted? Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. Ross, do you want to come back on that one?
Yeah, so I can see your point, Adrienne, and maybe the way to fix it is to have a BC noting this discussion that we've raised it, and we don't see conceptual differences between the definitions, but this is the definition. I think we do need, for the purposes of this standard, in both the revenue standards, just for the simple fact that we do have slightly different definitions, and we are not intending this to override or have people interpret those other definitions differently. So we don't want them looking at this definition when they're looking at IPSAS 32 or IPSAS 35. And that's our policy when we have more similar definitions in different standards. We just be clear which standards it refers to. So I do think we do. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Ross. But I think addressing Adrienne's points, and I think also, just recording the fact that we've had this discussion from a stakeholder perspective, then you're right that we should have a basis for conclusion that just explains what we've done. Because I certainly agree with Adrienne that we don't want to cast doubt on the definition. I think it's actually just explaining the situation and that we've done the analysis. Okay, so if I can then move to David, followed by Lucy, and then Mike.
Thank you, Ian. My question is about the change from both parties to two or more. I wonder whether it would be better for clarity if we put all parties, so so that the rights and obligations are applicable to all parties to the arrangement.
Okay, thanks, David. So what I'll do is I'll take the comments from the other two members who want to come in and then go back to staff for a reaction on that proposal. So I've got Lucy and then Mike.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree with the staff's recommendation to retain the definition of binding arrangement as is currently proposed in the draft revenue standard. In my opinion, it is the full revised definition is comprehensive enough to describe the term binding arrangement, since it covers the three main elements, which are rights and obligations, enforceability, and parties with enforceable rights. However, I share the comments of Camira and also of David on the inconsistencies in the terms of when we describe rights and obligations, similar, enforceable. And I noticed that in the in the conceptual framework, which is also presented in Appendix A, we use the term unconditional right. So that is in PC 5.4 and 5.5, the conceptual framework. And so the term used to describe rights is unconditional rights to resources, typically results from contracts or other binding arrangements that require provision of resources to the entity in the future. So I've heard the comment of Ross. So this is a potential area that we can look into when if we want to have consistencies in our standards. And on the use of the all parties, I think it is as suggested by David. That is also my suggestion, that instead of indicating two or more, all parties. So it would cover multiple parties to the binding arrangement. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. So what I'll do is I'll just take Mike's comments and then go briefly back to staff, because I've got various other members wanting to come in now, but I'd just like, to hand back to Eileen after Mike's comment.
Thanks, Ian. And I've been reflecting on the use of the word enforceability. Enforceability, I think, applies where we've got a binding arrangement that can be made binding by legal or equivalent means, and therefore can't be made binding if it's a non-legally binding arrangement. And I'm wondering then whether the use of the word enforceability is in the right place. So I would prefer something that said a binding arrangement is an arrangement that confers both rights and obligations that are enforceable by legal or equivalent means to all parties to the arrangement. So I'm just trying to make it explicit that it's got to be enforceable by legal or equivalent means in this definition.
This is where the whole thing starts to unravel if we're not careful.
Yeah.
Can we agree the rest of the definition, Mike, and come back to that point when we've had the discussion on legal or equivalent? Because otherwise we're just going to be circling around all of this. So if we can hold that specific point and just debate the other points on this for now.
Okay, so in the meantime, I might just shoot what I'm proposing through to Ross.
Yeah, but I don't want, we've got to have the other discussion before we get into this legal, whether we put legal or enforceable here. Because we don't know where that discussion is going to get to. So Eileen, can I just go back to you temporarily, and then I'm going to go to the other members?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thanks, member, for the comments. So it sounds like a few members think that maybe taking out two or more and using all parties might be an option. That was something that staff kind of thought about as well. And I think where the tripping point might occur is that there could be other parties that are actually third-party beneficiaries, which would still qualify as a party, but they don't necessarily have rights and obligations within the arrangement itself. So perhaps what we could do, if two or more is a bit too wordy, or maybe we'll, also still not fully clarify, perhaps we could use the parties, which is the plural wording usage that we have in some of the other definitions as well. So then the overall definition would just say, the parties instead of two or more parties or both parties. I'm seeing a few nods from members, but happy to hear any other comments if there's a different preference. In regards to Lucy's comment about the conceptual framework, I think when we were doing the overall analysis, we didn't note any conceptual inconsistencies with how we have described it in the conceptual framework. It's only mentioned in one place, and the conceptual framework is meant to be a guide for us. And if we do deviate in any way within the standard itself, it's specific to the standard. Now, I think if we compare the definitions and descriptions across the other IPSAS, as we noted, there are conceptual consistencies. So I think we still might be in an okay place for that. But I'm happy to touch base with you offline if I've misunderstood your comment on that.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So just in terms of framing the rest of the discussion, then we've had the discussion thus far about consistency with other definitions. We know we're focused on the definition for revenue and transfer expenses. We've agreed that we'll retain, for the purposes of this standard, the proposal is that we should go to on the parties to the arrangement. We need to hold Mike's comment on enforceable rights and obligations until we've had that discussion. So if I can ask for further comments and input based on where that stage in the discussions. So I've got Chris, Lindy and Todd.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry for coming in late. I took ill this morning, so I'm not feeling really well. So pardon me for taking you a little bit back. I am looking at the project summary, the cover page of the agenda item.
Chris, can we have that? Can we deal with that? I'll come back to that at the end of this item. I just want to focus on the definition for now, please.
All right.
That's okay. So can I go to Lindy then?
Thank you. So I was going to suggest what Eileen suggested, having the parties to the arrangement, just to avoid confusion about third-party beneficiary. So obviously the detail explaining the definitions is important, but I think it would be a good idea to signal up front that it's just the parties to the arrangement. It wouldn't be a third-party beneficiary or anybody else. So I do support that. I guess just saying, well, reflecting and saying, well, conceptually it isn't any different, and you could have arrangements where parties have rights and obligations. I guess, again, the detail is important because I do think that the rights and obligations might not arise at the same time. There could be different events that give rise to those, and they might not be the same. They might not be equal. So I guess I could say, sure, let's go with the definition, but when it comes to the detail, might have different views. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Todd?
Thanks, Ian. And I did contemplate lowering my hand because I think Eileen really nailed the point that I wanted to make. And I think having the parties and the definition keeps it closer to what's in the definition and the other standards. So that's another good reason, I think, to go with the parties, because it keeps it more aligned, and I think it deals with the issue adequately. So well done.
Okay, thanks, Todd, for that confirmation. So in terms of summarising where we've got to, leaving aside Mike's point about enforceable rights and obligations at the moment, I want to check then that members are happy that we have amended the definition. The only amendment we've made to the staff proposal is that it will be obligations on the parties to the arrangement, and that we approve that definition subject to that further discussion when we discuss legal enforceability. I've got Lynn, and then, oh, hang on, sorry, Lynn, you want to come in. Everybody, I'm getting thumbs up from a lot of other people, so I was a bit confused on that. Lynn, go ahead.
Can I just be clear? So we're only being asked to approve right now for the revenue standard. I just want to be clear, because I guess I had some comments when I applied this definition on the expenses standard, which I've not been raising because I thought we were just agreeing on the revenue standard. So I just wanted to be clear.
I thought we were doing both both standards. Can I get clarification from staff on that?
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Lynn. So right now, as proposed, it is currently in the context of revenue. In the next paper, the first recommendation we have is that essentially the reasons and the definition that's proposed is also appropriate for transfer expenses. So if you'd like, we can maybe take that in the second paper. Right now, the intention is to focus on the revenue side first.
Well, sorry, I thought we were trying to be conceptually consistent, and if you want a different definition in transfer expenses, then I think that's potentially problematic. I mean, I recognise that you would have the same, you know, for the purposes of this standard. So, Lynn, what's your concern from the transfer expenses point of view?
So it's not necessarily dissimilar to the points that Mike's raising, but I think my concern is to be clear enough in this definition whether or not the definition encompasses both legally binding obligations and non-legally binding obligations.
Okay, so Lynn, if we can, you know, I want to have the discussion on you know, that area of illegal enforceability, and we will then come back to the impact on the definition, which Mike has quite rightly raised. So if you're okay with the other changes, then with that caveat that we have to get that right for, you know, but I think it's back to we really need to be consistent. I think the principle is we need to be consistent between the standards. So whatever we use to describe this definition of a binding arrangement on the revenue side should be the same definition as on the transfer expense side.
So in addition to the point that Mike's raised, then I guess my other observation, but maybe we'll return to it when we get to, and I know staff will get to onerous contracts, but we should perhaps, when we get there, consider the other definitions that we've looked at do use the word similar when it talks about rights and obligations, which depending on whether or not we want to scope in or out onerous contracts, if we want to scope them out, using similar might help us.
Can I have advice from staff on this, please?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn and Ian. So we did have the offline discussion with Lynn on this point too, so we do take note that, and we can confirm that it is on staff's docket to come back and discuss onerous contracts, particularly on the transfer expense side. So it is in the project plan. We will be presenting something there. And so we can definitely connect with Lynn as well and make sure we kind of capture the point on similar and whether we use that term as part of that overall analysis. At this point in time, I think the definition is still a bit more of an isolated discussion, if you will. So I think as Ian's alluded to, if we are okay within conceptually consistent for the suite of standards, then we can probably nail this down and then focus on onerous contracts at that later session.
Okay. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. So if you're looking for an informal sort of vote on the definition now, then I'm happy to support it based on, you know, we come back to enforceability a little bit later in the evening. But I think we do need a BC to explain to people that we've changed the definition based on what we had in the exposure draft.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, I think that's, you know, if staff can take that away and come back with that, you're right, we should explain that change in a BC. Okay, so with that, I've got two outstanding points to pick up in terms of points that members made earlier. Patricia, did you want to come in now based on where we've got to on the definition?
In fact, my question is about the at least one present obligation. I'm not sure if I should discuss now or in the next paper.
Let's deal with the discussion on legal enforceability and then see if you still want to make the points after we've had that, if that's okay. And Chris, I'm going to come back to you, but after we've finished on binding arrangements. Okay, so Eileen, back to you then.
Thanks, Ian. The second recommendation that I think we've started to kind of talk about, but it'd be good to hear if members have any further significant concerns on the proposed guidance that won't necessarily be covered in the enforceability discussion we have later. We'd be happy to take those comments now. If you have any wording or editorial or even shifting certain paragraphs around because you think it's more appropriate in another section, for example, we'd be happy to connect offline just to make sure that we provide as sufficient number of minutes available to us to have a robust discussion on the other two papers. So I can definitely take a pause here in case there's any before moving on to the next paper.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So this is any issues of principle with what staff have done with the drafting in 6.3.1 on binding arrangements. Yeah, Todd.
Well, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to clarify one thing probably first, and then maybe a comment on 6.3.1. So is the intention with what's being done in paper 6.3.1 to incorporate that material in both EDs 70 and EDs 71? That could be clarified.
Thanks, Todd. So, I mean, at the moment, what we're focusing on will be ED 71. Is based on ED 71. I think that's right, Eileen, isn't it? That we're not taking ED 71.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I can provide a bit more color. Sorry, it might be my internet. Yeah. I don't mean to cut you off. So in March, when we first talked about, what do we want to do with guidance? How are we going to move forward with it? A few members did propose a pretty useful way forward in staff's opinion, where we first write the guidance without thinking about which ED or which final standard it will go into. So just make sure that the guidance itself fully covers the principles, explains the principles, and provides the right level of guidance for those principles. And once we are completely comfortable with that overall package of guidance, if you will, then we can make the determination of whether all of it sits in both of the final standards or in selective components. And it's something that we're going to have to come back to make sure we have it in the right places. But ED 71 is definitely going to be the primary area where we have the guidance. It'll be a matter of what parts of it will get replicated, if you will, into ED 70. So there will be duplication to help make sure it is freestanding. But right now, we're just trying to make sure that the wording we have in the guidance is appropriate to capture the concepts and the principles themselves.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That helps. I suppose then the comment that I've got here is that when I read through 6.3.1, we are flipping between language that we've used in ED 70 and language that we used in ED 71. So we start talking about purchases and the goods and services that are being transferred in places, and then we flip to transfer providers and recipients. And I think it comes across a little bit confused as it's drafted because it chops and changes between that language. So I'm wondering whether, if the intention is this is going to be our guidance around this, that we need to take a lens to this of getting a consistency of language in the way that we're describing what we're doing here, because it does come across very disjointed in my mind as I read it.
Thanks, Todd. So I think, if we say that when you will see this initially in the draft final standard is in the standard being developed from ED 71 in September. And if you take that lens to it, in terms of, I think that's very helpful, in terms of providing staff with some suggestions on consistency of language, that would be really helpful. But if we have that as the way forward, that the revenue, we will first look at ED 71, or the standard developed from ED 71 in September, and you'll see it dropped in there. So Todd, if you're okay to give comments based on that, I think that would be really helpful. Okay, so I've got Kamira next.
Thanks. And similar to what Todd's mentioned, my suggestion would be to focus always in the from which perspective we are talking about. If we are writing the exposure draft or the standards on revenue, then we should refer, for instance, to the entity and clarify from the very beginning that the entity is the reporting entity that will apply the standard. So that means it's the entity who will receive the revenue, right? So that, and then refer to, instead of referring to purchaser or to transfer provider, we can refer to the other party, because we are taking the binding arrangement definition as our starting point, and there we are talking about the party. So we can, on the one side, talk about the entity, who is the one registering the revenue, and on the other side to the other party. So it will be much more helpful, and it will be consistent independently if we will have one standard of revenue or two standards. It would apply the same text for all of them. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamira. I saw support for that from members. Eileen, is that okay?
Yeah, thanks. And just to highlight that we did note that there are some inconsistencies right now in the wording. And part of that is, as Tom mentioned, there are some cases where we already say purchaser or goods or services. Those were, when we first went through it, specific paragraphs that definitely were going to be in eventual ED 70. And those were, for example, the 5-step model and the application of it. So it would always be in the context of performance obligations. But we do have a note here for ourselves, and we promise we will get to it to make sure that the wording we use is consistent. I do take Camira's note, and we'll keep that in mind as we go through. But we'll have to make sure that, especially with ED 70, if we want to maintain alignment or consistency with IFRS 15, they use the word purchaser. So we might just need to consider that, given that that standard it's going to be reflective of those exchange type transactions as well, and purchaser might still be appropriate. But we do have that as part of the analysis that we will be doing in the final revisions of the wording in the guidance. So thanks very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Eileen. Patricia, it's you.
Yes, thank you. In relation to the text, I think there is a consequence to consider the definition of bilateral arrangement, and one of the consequences is the difference between binding obligation and present obligation. Sometimes one paragraph is not consistent with another paragraph. For example, but so I think it's not necessary to, I can indicate the paragraph offline, but I think it's necessary to align the concepts, because the bind obligation is different of present obligation. And it's my point, it's my main point. The present obligation occur when the transaction or the past event exists, and not necessarily the past event is in the same moment that the entity enters into the bilateral arrangement. I think it's the main inconsistency in the text. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think that's one of the advantages of going top down, that if we agree the principles, then we start to see that coming, we expect to see that coming through the text. So thanks for that comment. Eileen, I'm assuming that's okay in terms of just working offline with Patricia to pick up the concerns that she's identified on specific instances. Okay.
Happy to.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so I think with that, we've agreed the definition subjects. We need to come back to that point, Mike's point. If there are, just to reiterate, and I think, you know, this is helpful starting to go through the developed text at this stage. We've got specific consistency points coming from Todd and Patricia. And if other people can pass drafting points through to staff, that would be really helpful. And then we can see that back. And I think it will help us to see this in the shell of a draft final standard in September. And then we can really start to orient ourselves. But that will be the one on the revenue side based on ED 71 at this stage. Okay. So Eileen, move us on then.
Okay, so the second paper is sort of an extension of the prior paper, but from the transfer expense side. So in April, the board did discuss the implications of some of the decisions from March, one of which was reaffirming or retaining the concept and definition of a binding arrangement. So at the time, the board agreed that there is no difference in the concept of a binding arrangement between the two projects, and that it's important to maintain consistency. And so the only change here is really a change in perspective. And thus there's no conceptual or principle-based reason to have a different definition for transfer expenses. Now, since the IPSASB had decided that the suites should individually stand alone, the staff have proposed to incorporate this definition that we just discussed in the last paper directly into the transfer expense standard, instead of making reference to the future revenue standard or standards. So that would be the first recommendation. The second is related to the proposed guidance, which is in 6.3.2. And this guidance is generally consistent with what we've proposed in 6.3.1. So we do take the comments that have been raised by members already about consistency in terminology, and just making sure we get that right between all of the standards, and to defer where appropriate. The one thing we wanted to highlight is that the guidance presented in 6.3.2 is currently more limited than what was proposed for revenue. And so specifically, we are only providing core text and application guidance on the definitions, because right now there are still some discussions that will be ongoing or will be upcoming on other components of the standard. So for example, the distinction between transfer expenses with and without performance obligations is still a conversation that we will be having. And depending on where we land with that discussion, there would be a trickle impact on the recognition and the measurement components of the transactions that arise from binding arrangements. Now, some of the guidance you'll see in here are also repeats to ensure that they are going to be freestanding suite of standards, but with the change in perspective. So similar to the last paper, we're happy to take any significant concerns about the proposed guidance that isn't necessarily an overlap from the revenue side. And similarly, we're happy to take any wording or editorial comments that board members might have offline, and to work together there to make sure we get the wording right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. So we know we have Lynn's points on onerous contracts that has to be dealt with. We have the same point that we need to deal with enforceability. Any other challenges to using the same definition? Okay, so I've got Mike, then Lynn, then Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure what I'm thinking about at the moment. I'm trying to now say to myself, does this definition of a binding arrangement work for the service provider? And I suppose it does. I'm trying to just say, if this is all about what the service providers can have to evaluate and decide whether they have an asset or an expense or not. I think it works. I just wasn't sure, that's all.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is flip the positioning here. So, okay, so go to Lynn next.
Thanks, Ian. So I have had some useful offline discussions with staff, I guess, on my point on this, but it wasn't until I had those discussions with staff did I realise that staff's intention on the expenses side is that the arrangements that we are considering as binding arrangements are those that are legally binding obligations in the conceptual framework, and not those non-legally binding obligations in the conceptual framework. Now, this may come in a discussion on enforceability.
I think it will.
I guess the challenge is making sure that the text and the boundaries are clear here, because we've debated the number of revenue standards, but we have already got IPSAS 19 that is talking about certain forms of obligation and results in recognition of expenditure in the financial statements. And so my concern is to make sure we are clear on, in our drafting, on scope of what's in the expenses standard here versus what's in constructive obligation. And my nervousness was that some of the text drove me as I was reading it to feel that there was a blurring about, does this include constructive obligation or doesn't it? And so I do think there could be some clarity that the transfer expenses binding arrangements we are talking about are those that are legally binding obligations in the conceptual framework, not those that are non-legally binding obligations.
Thanks, Lynn. As you say, there's an overlap there into the discussion that we're going to have next on enforceability. But I think you're entirely right as well in terms of that, the linkage between this standard and IPSAS 19, and certainly that's something that constituents brought up in their comments. Eileen, do you want to just reflect back on that? I mean, I think at the moment, Lynn, we need to hold that, don't we, and make sure that that comes through when we've bottomed the enforceability discussion. That's okay. Eileen?
Thanks, Chair. And thank you, Lynn. And I'm happy to hear that our offline discussion was helpful to provide some of that clarity. I guess the only thing I would add just for the board as a whole is that on our project plan, we do have an eventual paper on scope for transfer expenses planned. And there we will be addressing the constituent comments that Ian noted, where some of the respondents just wanted more clarity on what the delineation is in terms of scoping, what goes into IPSAS 19 and what not. And I'd echo what Ian is saying about enforceability as a whole. We do have a slide dedicated to the legal or equivalent means, where we really try to emphasize that it is conceptually consistent with how we're considering legal obligations in the framework, and that it's not intended to be non-legally binding obligations, but we can go into that in more detail for sure in the next paper. I'm happy to pass it to Paul if there's anything he wanted to add to that as well, because I know we had a few offline discussions about the scoping piece as well.
Well, I'd rather not. I think we can take those comments later, and reflect back on them when we've done the discussion on enforceability. Thomas, to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. As I said at the first day, the CAG had a long discussion on transfer expenses, a couple of aspects in its meeting on Monday, but one aspect was related to binding arrangements as well. So I think it could be suitable to feed in this point here. We didn't discuss exactly the question Eileen put to you on her slide regarding the definition, but kind of asking or answering to the question Mike just asked whether it does work for transfer providers. I think the CAG discussion would kind of lead to the answer that yes, it does. Probably with regards to binding arrangement, there was agreement that this is an important instrument to ensure consistency in application of the guidance when qualifying transactions in general. And some members at that point in time thought that this alone does not solve the question as to what the point in time an expense has to be recognized. Enforceability is the issue, which is ultimately important. Therefore, I think it would work to kind of transfer it or translate it into the transfer expenses. And in this context, staff clarified their understanding that if an arrangement is not enforceable, then it's not a binding arrangement. I think that was important to understand for CAG members as well. Just to add that some members saw a specific execution problem in developing countries when enforceability is not existing. And for these cases, the guidance should simply propose immediately in expending the transfer. So this is just a side remark, but it was made in this context. So just to kind of feed in this aspect, there are a couple of more aspects, but I will provide them later.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Thomas. So I think going back to the question that staff have posed in the first place, and noting that we have this discussion that we've got to be clear about in terms of legal or equivalent, and the bridge and the relationship in relation to IPSAS 19, non-legally binding and so on. Are people content that we do use the same definition? Okay. Right, good, okay. So I think we ask the same question as we did with the guidance that is proposed in 6.3.2. Clearly, we have the caveats, as Eileen has summarised, that, you know, Todd's point in terms of consistency of language, and you know, Patricia also made that point. So those we accept need to come through, you know, as in the next version when we see this dropped into a shell. Are there any other points of principle that anybody wants to raise on the transfer expenses drafting in item 6.3.2? Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised on that. So as staff have requested, please do pass detailed drafting comments and so on through to them. So I think that moves us then on to the discussion in 6.2.3 on enforceability. Eileen?
Yep. Just going to share my screen again. Okay. All right, so this moves us into the second part, if you will, of today's session. The first paper that we're presenting here is on how enforceability is exercised, and this again is in the context of binding arrangements. Now, as discussed in March and highlighted at the beginning of this session, enforceability is an integral component of a binding arrangement, and numerous IPSASB decisions have associated with the principle of enforceability, and those have occurred throughout the life of this project. Now, the intention of this paper and what we're going to try to walk through in today's presentation is really to help enforce and clarify the principle on enforceability, because the solid footing that we have on this principle is going to be able to help us in advancing the discussion on the existence of a liability on the revenue project and also the existence of an asset on the transfer expense project. So we thought it might be helpful to provide a more detailed presentation on this topic today before we go into the robust discussions to highlight some of these key decisions in the ED development phase and also when reviewing the ED responses to bring it all together.
And Eileen, just to say before, I think what we might do is when you've done the presentation, we'll take the break at that point in time and then we'll go into the discussion, I think. Okay. So if you do the presentation and then we'll break at that point.
Okay, so initially I was planning to pause between certain slides, but maybe what I'll do is I'll flow through all of them. Would you still prefer that then to get to the break?
Go through until you get to a point where you think you would take a break and then we'll see.
I'll let you know. Okay. All right, let me find my share screen button again. Okay, hopefully that showed. All right, so in this first slide, we are trying to, well, visually, we're trying to put together some of the puzzle pieces for the concept of enforceability, but what we're really trying to highlight is some of the key decisions that we've made along the way that relate to enforceability to help us really crisp up the concept itself. So the first piece is that enforceability is integral to the concept and the definition of a binding arrangement. And this was reinforced in our March discussions where the board decided that making an enforceability is what makes an arrangement binding because it holds the involved parties accountable and is based on the ability to enforce and not the probability of enforcement. The second thing is regarding what, and this was also discussed in March. There have been non-authoritative guidance and examples presented in the EDs, which went out in 2020 about this. And after that, after reviewing the constituent comments received, the board did discuss in March and also confirmed that enforceability can arise from various mechanisms. And because of that, the entity should determine whether it has an enforceable, i.e. binding arrangement, by assessing all of the relevant factors, as several factors may give rise to enforceability. The third piece, which we've started to talk about today already, is that this enforceability is created through legal or equivalent means. Now, this term was already used in the EDs that were issued, and it was influenced by the public sector reality where entities may enter into arrangements and obtain rights and obligations in various ways. So whether it's through legal contracts, legislative or executive authority, cabinet or ministerial directives, etc. And some entities cannot enter into legal arrangements in their own name. This also influenced the board's decision to use the term binding arrangement to encompass arrangements that entities may enter that have the force of a contract without necessarily being a contract. Now, when we say legal means, we mean judicial means, so being able to enforce your rights and obligations in court. When we talk about equivalent means, this is meant to capture the ways in which entities that cannot engage or cannot enter legal arrangements can still enter and enforce binding arrangements in a similar manner as those that enter and enforce with contract law. So in a sense, this means it's enforceable like the force of law through alternative enforcement processes. Equivalent means is essentially like legal for the public sector context. Now, equivalent means and legal means are both consistent with the conceptual framework concept of legal obligation, which was presented in Chapter 5, where it says that legal obligation includes both transactions enforced through a variety of legal constructs, through laws of contract, and through alternative processes with equivalent effect. We wanted to highlight here that this differs and is not intended to capture non-legal, which is related to non-legally binding obligations in the conceptual framework or constructive obligations as per IPSAS 19. So those are some of the key past decisions that kind of brought together to think about enforceability. And what the paper is trying to do and what we're going to go through in a bit more detail today is rounding out the principle of enforceability by looking at some example scenarios to help illustrate how enforceability is exercised in a binding arrangement. We have provided additional details in the paper as well about when and how consequences arise and how the exercise of enforceability will impose consequences. So at this point, I'm going to move on to the first scenario that we're going to go through. And this is also presented in the paper, but we thought maybe doing a walkthrough today in the presentation might help us make sure that we're looking at both scenarios and thinking about the principle itself overall. So in the first scenario, we're going to assume that it is just two parties involved in the binding arrangement, and the transfer provider is the first party to begin fulfilling its obligations. Now, this scenario is generally the more common fact pattern in the public sector, where the resources are provided by the transfer provider before a transfer recipient begins fulfilling its stated performance or present obligations. So in the first step, the parties would enter into the new arrangement. They both have enforceable rights and obligations, but neither have fulfilled their obligations. In the second step, we would say that the transfer provider has fulfilled the obligation. This means that the binding arrangement itself is now partially fulfilled. If the transfer recipient doesn't fulfill its stated obligation, then the transfer provider still has its unfulfilled right and can exercise its enforceability mechanisms within the binding arrangement to resolve the non-completion. Now, the transfer provider can enforce in two ways. The first is to compel the transfer recipient to actually fulfill its stated obligations. And the second type of result is to impose consequences because the transfer recipient did not fulfill its stated obligations. Now, obviously, ideally, the transfer provider is able to compel the transfer recipient to actually complete its stated obligations. And in this case, by compelling the transfer recipient to resolve its non-completion by fulfilling the obligations not yet completed, they are essentially, in essence, completing the binding arrangement. However, if the non-compliant party does not resolve its non-completion, then that party cannot avoid the consequences. So if we kind of take a step back and we think about the imposition of consequences, if the transfer recipient cannot be compelled to fulfill its obligations in the binding arrangement, then effectively enforceability would enable the transfer provider to impose consequences on the transfer recipient for its non-completion. Now, stepping back, that means that the identified enforceability mechanisms enable the transfer provider to retain control over the resources they have transferred and to hold the transfer recipient accountable until the recipient is compelled to fulfill its obligations or face the consequences if they do not. So I had a break planned here, Ian, just to take the slides down and see if there were any questions about this scenario before moving on to scenario 2.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. If we do that, then we'll do scenario 2 and then we'll take a break.
Yep.
Okay, so if you take the slides down and just check whether there are any questions or points members want to raise on what's been said thus far. Yes, Adrienne.
So my issue is on the precise phrasing in the background part, that enforceability is based on ability and not probability. I know we've gone through this, but I'm uncomfortable with the idea that you could have enforceability based on ability, but zero probability. My interest in all of this has been to reduce the number of times that the issue of a binding arrangement comes up, and this seems to me that it makes it broader than we had discussed until now. So in other words, the phrase based on ability and not probability is awkward for me because of this possibility that it could be based on ability to enforce, even if it was never going to be enforced. I wanted to exclude where we know governments are just not going to enforce. Then I think accountants should just ignore the existence of ability to enforce. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. Eileen.
Sorry, I had trouble finding my unmute button. Thanks for the intervention, Adrienne. And I guess when we thought about, ability and probability, we thought probability is in essence kind of tied to ability, because if you have zero probability, then it's probably indicative that you don't have the ability anyway. But what we're trying to really capture is it's about the essence, right, of the binding arrangement. And if you have the ability, then in essence it is, and in substance, the arrangement is binding. Whether you do or don't enforce it, I would say it kind of comes down to almost a measurement issue instead, because if you're choosing not to enforce it, or if the probability of not enforcing is there, then it's not quite an identification or recognition issue per se. So I think ability is definitely still more appropriate in assessing it. The concern you mentioned, and I think in one of our previous discussions as well, about the magnitude and the volume of arrangements in the public sector with binding arrangements, I guess it'd just be good to highlight here as well that generally, the majority of public sector revenues is going to be in the ED 71 standard, which might not come from binding arrangements at all. Binding arrangements is meant to capture a specific set of revenue transactions and transfer expense transactions where there is that two-way enforceability. And that enforceability is very important in identifying the binding arrangements and then the appropriate accounting from there.
So I think just to add, and then we will go back to you, Adrienne, I think there is an accountability issue here. If you have the ability to enforce and you are choosing not to, that is a decision, but there is an accountability in terms of the use of resources here. So I think it is important that we do stick to ability and not probability. Then there may well be, then there's a measurement issue, which is actually then there's an impairment that you should record. But the fundamental thing from an accountability point of view is you have the ability to enforce, and you're just not doing that. Okay.
May I come back on this? So my concern is that in a way, every government has the ability, partly when you think of higher levels of government and their power over lower levels of government. It's very rare that lower levels of government are completely independent. And secondly, the ability is when it's through the court system. Budget people get really nervous about the idea of tying up. So the ability to enforce through the court system might be there, but one would really want to minimize the idea that governments will pursue this through the court system, even though the ability is there, because it's so costly and so the gains are so small relative to the effort. And so I think the ability might always be there, but it doesn't mean that first of all, the probability of applying that ability might be very low. And secondly, we would, well, I'm not sure, I can't talk for IPSASB here, but thinking of good budget practice, you wouldn't encourage governments to apply the ability because it would be some.
Can we just step back, Adrienne, from this? We're not in anything where there isn't a binding arrangement here. So we're not in the generality of funds provided without a binding arrangement. We here are talking about where there is a binding arrangement, and that binding arrangement will have been put in with an aim in mind in terms of achieving a particular desired result. And in assessing whether you put that in, then you will have taken the decision that actually, if I need to enforce this, I will. So I think, can we just look at this from the point of view of we have entered into a binding arrangement from the accounting perspective, and we are writing accounting guidance here, that is the consequence. What we, from a budget perspective, you can then make the decision as to whether you decide to enter into a binding arrangement or not, being clear on the reporting consequences. So this is about the reporting consequences. And what we're trying to do is make it clear, if you construct an arrangement in that way, this is what will happen in the reporting context, because we're a financial reporting board, we're not a budgeting board. So this is about where there is a binding arrangement. We're trying to be clear about what a binding arrangement actually is. Then this is what the reporting consequences are.
Just to say, I think it's circular, but however, okay.
Okay. Then in terms of members, I've got Lindy, Camira, and then Thomas wants to come in. You're on mute, Lindy.
Sorry, pushing the wrong buttons. So I understand holding entities accountable and exercising my rights as a consequence of non-compliance. But what I am struggling a little bit in my head is we're saying it's legally enforceable as if in a court of law. But if I have fulfilled my obligation to transfer, I can't immediately go to a court and enforce the other party to perform on day 1 or day 2, because they would have had to demonstrate that they've tried or haven't done something. So I guess for me, that aspect of saying that, yes, that I can hold them accountable, but does that give me a right up front? I don't know. I struggle a little bit with that because of how I would exercise that at on day 1 or even day 2. I think there would have to be a default event, but that's just where I am at the moment. Thanks.
Ross, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, just I think the legal enforceability in the arrangement from the transfer provider perspective gives you the right over the resources you've transferred until the other party performs after you've transferred them. So I don't think you need to be in legal default to have the right over those resources. I think what you're saying is the other party hasn't earned those resources yet, and you have an arrangement that allows you to take legal action if you need to. Therefore, you still control the assets. So I think whether you're in legal default or not is a different issue. And I think it's to the point that Eileen explained earlier, that the binding arrangement sets out the actions the receiver is going to take with the resources you're providing so they can perform to earn the revenue, and then you no longer have the right to reclaim those resources. You can't take legal action because they've performed. But in the event they don't perform as the binding arrangement, you can still take action to get back your resources. So I don't agree with the fact that because you haven't taken legal action that you wouldn't have a right. And I mean, if that was the case, then you'd have the same issue even in commercial transactions. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay, thanks, Ross. I'll let Lindy just sort of ponder that one, and I'll go to Camira next.
Thanks, Chair. In regards with the definition of ability and probability, I do support the idea of using ability to decide or to assess if there is enforceability, so if there is enforceability ability, no, rather than the probability. But then I got confused because in the guidance there's another paragraph when you're talking about taking into account the past experience, and you mentioned that if the purchaser in the past experience has not enforced their rights, then it's not a binding arrangement. So I think it's important to be consistent, and also from the perspective of okay, if there is the reporting entity, probably will try to find a way to argument that there is no enforceability, and therefore they will not apply the they will just register more closely to cash base according when they receive the resource, because they'll say, well, there is no enforceability. So we should be careful on how we can close those gaps and try to reduce this discretionality or this just to avoid that the entities maybe take the easier way and just register based on when they receive their cash or their resources. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. So I think we do need to be clear then in terms of being consistent. And I think, we need to consider whether we, because this was certainly raised by constituents. I know that we've muddied the waters on this. Eileen, maybe we do need to just put something else in that talks about, if you like, the measurement consequences of this.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Camira. And I guess my just first reaction, and we can definitely take this away and think about it further. The past experience piece about whether you have or have not enforced, past history, that was consistent with IFRS 15, and I think there they had kind of indicated that that was an indication of ability or lack of ability to actually enforce, but not necessarily the probability per se. But we can definitely take this off and just make sure we, as you say, make sure we're closing the gaps and there isn't any inconsistency in what we're trying to tell users to consider when they're considering enforceability.
So thanks, Eileen. So I think really what we're saying is if there is the ability to enforce, then if you actually maybe don't enforce sometimes, that actually might be a measurement issue, because then you're going to make some form of provision. So I think if you can just really clarify that through, I think that would help. So if we have that as an instruction, just to clarify on that point for next time. Thomas has been waiting to come in, and then I'll go to Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. And first of all, thanks to Eileen for the very clear presentation of what are the 4 aspects of enforceability. I think the CAG also struggled to understand what exactly drives enforceability. So I think that's very important to make that crystal clear. I think the aspect of ability and probability is really important, because the main question is exactly what Camira just has asked: what is the impact of past behavior? And it's not only IFRS 15 where we kind of come across that. I think we kind of got that as a remark, Ian, from constituents regarding IPSAS 23 as well, when we had to decide between a condition and a restriction. Past behavior was the decisive criteria whether a condition is really a condition, because the question was it enforced in the past? So I think we need to kind of be careful that we don't create the same problem again. And I think Camilla rightly alluded to this aspect. I agree with you. I think it's an accountability issue. It's a measurement issue for the transfer provider because he would impair his right or his asset. But the question is, what is the effect from a transfer recipient perspective? Because he would not have the perspective of the transfer provider to say, okay, I have the ability, but I don't want to. He has a completely different perspective. And for him, it's the question revenue or liability. And this is a recognition issue, not a measurement issue. So it has an impact whether a transfer recipient says, okay, there might be the ability, but they never came back to me. So they will not this time again. I recognize revenue.
Thanks, Thomas. So I think in terms of, where we're getting to is it should be ability, but I think there is some, we need some further thinking just to really bottom this point about, if there is evidence of not enforcing that ability in the past, then what's the measurement consequences of that from an accountability perspective? And if you can take that instruction away, Eileen, just so that we can bottom this finally. So I'm going to take Patricia and then Lynn, and then I'm going to go to the break. Patricia.
Thank you. My question is related to the ability versus probability too, but specifically about the terms of contract or the terms of the bilateral arrangement, because I think it's the terms itself, it's not a mechanism of enforceability, because the bilateral arrangement may have some penalties or the term that entity needs to return the fund, but if it's not, for example, it's impossible to enforce in court. It's not possible. It's not in mechanism of enforceability. My question here is sometimes the text present the idea that the terms of the contract or the bilateral arrangement is itself a mechanism of enforceability, and I think it's not. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Eileen, do you want to just respond to Patricia's point then?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Patricia. I think maybe what we can clarify, and perhaps it was just not very clear through the paper, but hopefully we are or can be clear in the guidance. It's not that the terms themselves are definitely enforcement mechanisms. It's more considering the terms and thinking about both the implicit and explicit to say whether they are actually effective enforcement mechanisms. So there could be some cases where, say, you do have a right of return term in your binding arrangement, but in actuality, it doesn't effectively provide you a way to enforce the performance obligations and rights within that binding arrangement. Then it is not actually an effective or enforcement mechanism. So it's more identifying what could be, and then ensuring that they actually are effective enforceability mechanisms. So unfortunately, if that didn't come through clearly in the paper, I apologize for that. But we'll try to make sure that if there's any wording that we can add in or revise in the proposed guidance to make sure we are clear on that, please let us know, and we can put that in to really communicate that properly, because it's a very important point.
Right, okay. Thanks, Eileen. So Lynn.
So one of the points I had on enforceability was that the papers currently say you only assess enforceability at the outset. And then the more I hear the discussion about ability and looking at past experience and ability, I guess I'm of the view that enforceability can change over time. Maybe case law, maybe other things that could change it. And I think we should be clear about whether or not you assess enforceability and have I got a binding arrangement, and does that affect my income and expenditure recognition at each reporting period, not just at the outset.
Thanks, Lynn. Eileen?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Lynn. I think that definitely was a good part of our discussion, and I'm happy to share some thoughts with the wider board as well. In terms of whether it's just at inception or later on, part of the discussion and kind of the staff's thinking was you definitely assess it at the beginning. I don't think any of us disagree with that. But taking your point, there could be changes in whether a mechanism is still enforceable afterward. Now, our view is those cases are probably very rare, where something that used to be enforced in court now cannot be enforced through any legal means, and that would, even though rare, it could still occur. So in a sense, it's kind of like a regular assessment that you would do in other instances too, where it'll have implications on the accounting. And so there could be those reassessments, but it would be based on some significant kind of change in your overall jurisdiction, and not just on a very recurring or a short-term basis.
Can we, I mean, it seems like, I think it was a point that maybe we just need to take away in terms of how we clarify that, because in a way, to me, listening to what you were saying, Eileen, made me think it's a bit like a kind of, what you would do with impairment, actually, that you would look to see whether there are any indicators of impairment, which might well be, a legal judgment that said in similar types of cases, you can't enforce, or something like that. And I guess, Lynn, that's the sort of process that you had in mind, presumably.
Yeah, I think there's two options, aren't there? You either say you look for triggers, or you say you automatically do the assessment. I can understand a position that you at least look for triggers, but I think the current drafting where you only look at it once doesn't feel quite right. I think we should leave the door open.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps, Eileen, if you can go away and reflect on how we do that, but that sounds right, that obviously it's an initial assessment, but then you should probably look for triggers. Renee, I know you've got your hand up, but I think at this stage I'd like to actually take a break. So if we can come back to you when we come back from the break, if that's okay. Okay, so we break now, and then we come back at 22 in 10 minutes time. So David, if you can, as ever, keep us on track in terms of time. Okay, thanks everyone. See you back shortly.
1 minute.
Ian, can I use the fact that we're still on break to mention, I think there's a risk of losing common sense. I mean, I'm thinking of vaccines, where in the US, everyone is trying very hard to.
Can we go back? Can we just go back to the discussion, please? Because you know, we do need to bottom this point, and you know, I think what we're talking about here is this specific point on enforceability, and we need to bottom that, not have a bigger picture debate at this stage. So can I go to Renee's point, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Maybe the point I wanted to make, or the reflection I'm having, is similar to Adrienne's, and maybe it linked to what Lindy said also earlier. So I know we're focusing on trying to define enforceability and what it means and its impact on the accounting. I am concerned, and I do still question what the implications will be from a transfer's perspective. I'm wondering if it's because enforceability is linked to other authorities beyond a legal contract, legislative and executive authorities. And it's hard to properly articulate my point without going into practical examples. I've said it before, for me, wrapping my head around principles, it's very productive when we can try to apply those principles to practical examples. And I think that's what, Adrienne, maybe you were trying to do here. So at this point, I don't necessarily want to go down in the rabbit hole of bringing up examples, but I think that the concern is when the transferor has transferred the funds in a legal setting. If you think of a federation where the federal government makes transfers to another level of government. I know I'm getting into an example, but that's the only way I can try to articulate my question. In a federation, that's all set in, well, the roles and responsibilities of managing government affairs are set in legislation. Are we saying here that enforceability goes so far that government just providing a federal government providing a federal transfer to another level of government would have the power to enforce this other level of government to perform on a particular program? And because of that, then the transferor would have an asset as opposed to a grant expense. And I think for us, in our jurisdictions, it's all about the implication of enforceability on whether the transfer as an asset or an expense when the transfer has decided to transfer the funds. So in the staff's issue paper, the concern we have is more in that scenario one that Arlene outlined at the very end in the consequence, and questioning whether the recipient's default to perform is a future event, and one that would only become enforceable when that future event occurs. So maybe it's about the timing of how enforceability is executed in a contract. I'm going to stop here. I at least wanted to be on record to express that I still have a lot of questions in terms of what the implications will be of this principle. Thank you.
So I think the problem is, until we set the principle, you can't work it through in your jurisdictional consequence, in your jurisdictional situation, and know what's actually going to be happening. But what we need to do is be absolutely clear that if you have decided to give a grant or make an appropriation that is subject to terms that can be enforced through whatever the mechanism is, that there are consequences, and that, you know, it's about, you have made a choice to enter into a contract or a similar arrangement in a particular way, because either you want to give the resources and enforce, or you don't, and we need to provide the clarity over the principle. Then there's a question about how that works through. But what we're trying to be clear on is the principle here. Eileen, do you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, just a quick note, and perhaps this might be where some of the complexity and confusion is coming in our discussion. I don't disagree with what has been noticed so far, but I think what we also should tie it back to is that when we talk about binding arrangements, it's minimum two-way enforceability. And so in cases where you have an arrangement with, you know, one, like for example, the federal government that has enforceable rights and obligations, the other party might not have enforceable rights and obligations, and that would actually end up in just a different accounting overall. We'd be under 8071 and considering it as an arrangement or transaction that is not arising from a binding arrangement. So the paper as presented was proposed in a way that is only about binding arrangements in the context of binding arrangements, which means that we're looking at those subset of transactions, if you will, that are coming from binding arrangements, which means that both parties, or potentially more depending on the situation, they each have rights and obligations. So the paper and the concept we're presenting here is specific in the context of a binding arrangement and not for those transactions that are outside of it. Hopefully that helps to kind of clarify and help with the overall discussion, because enforceability on one side is obviously a little bit different.
Renee, back on that.
Well, yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Arlene. But again, in the federation, the lower government can enforce the higher government to receive the funds they need to fulfill their obligation at their governmental level. So again, when it's tied back to legislative authority, I'm hearing from the conversations and the proposal that the legislative authority is creating enforceable rights on both sides. The federal government to fund provincial health programs, and the provinces to expect that the federal government will provide the funding. So I seem to understand that enforceability exists even in a legislative federation setting, and that would create the accounting that I worry about. Thank you.
I mean, I think there is a logic to what we're saying, and you know, if that happens to be inconvenient, then you have to choose a different way of appropriating. What we're trying to do is be clear from an accounting point of view. If you take a particular route, what will the consequences be? Then, you know, so I'll take other, you know, but I think this is like, we're not setting budget standards, we're not dealing with the appropriation mechanisms and the detail of that in a particular jurisdiction. What we're saying is, we will be clear about, if you have an arrangement that has these characteristics, this will be the financial reporting consequence. That may change the way you choose to do a transaction, but that's fine, that's your choice. But once you've entered into it, this is the consequence. Okay, so I'm going to take Mike, then Mark, then Todd.
Thanks, Chair. So I can only reinforce what you just said. I was persuaded 6 months ago, I didn't agree. I would have been on Adrian's side and what Renee's been saying, but at the last meeting, I was persuaded that use of the ability at the time to enter into a binding arrangement, which we've agreed the definition for, binds the two parties or the three parties or how many parties there are to a certain set of course of action. And that then enables the ability for one party to get the other party to deliver. So I'm quite comfortable with use of the word ability where there is a binding arrangement as we've defined it.
Thanks, Mike. Mark, then Todd.
Having listened to the interesting discussion, I took note that the question of whether you take legal action or not, or they have a past history to take legal action, I don't think this should be in the center of the whole thing, because usually if you enter into a binding arrangement, both parties enter into it with the intention to fulfill it, and I think we also have these transactions like from the central government to state government, and there has never been a problem of not fulfilling it, or not in a way that you would challenge that the one party is not doesn't want to perform it. There may be in details, but so I think if we go down the route to ask, is it probable to take legal action, or is there a history? I think then we will really place a burden on the accounting, and I think it's also conceptually not right, as it was said. I think it's more a measurement issue. So I'm very comfortable with the ability, but also the question we say we're always talking about going to court, but I think we have as international standards. I think we have to think about that. Not all countries have the same legal system, and in some. Going to court is the ultimate measure. So it really depends on complex mechanism and also legislative mechanism. I think that's why I think it's very important we can agree on a principle that so that all jurisdictions the transactions can be covered, and I think it is of course a challenge, and therefore I think I would like to support what was proposed by the staff and to keep it really principle based, and I think the key is really that a binding arrangement and both parties who are willing to fulfill it, and the ability to go to take legal actions is actually more a means to ensure that it is fulfilled, more than the question going to court.
Thanks, Mark. And I see you're back on the laptop today, which is good. Todd, to you.
Thanks, Ian. And I think this is a really important conversation that we're having now, because it is important that the board has a common understanding of what we're dealing with here. And I think coming back to a point you made, Ian, we're just trying to set standards for particular types of transactions here. So if you have a binding arrangement, and I think we need to be clear on what we all understand by a binding arrangement. This could be the accounting consequences. And listening to what Renee was saying, I'm questioning whether what you have in the example that you used is a binding arrangement, because I think, we have tossed around some examples in the past where you are essentially providing some sort of general funding. You probably are not being specific enough in the arrangement that you're entering into to have to recognize revenue any other way than upfront, because it's not specific enough to know how else you would recognize revenue in some arrangement. So I think we need to be clear that to have a binding arrangement, there needs to be sufficient specificity in the arrangements for you to have some basis for recognizing revenue. And so quite general arrangements, I don't think would meet the criteria for a binding arrangement, certainly as I understand what we're doing here. But if others have different views on what we're doing here, that's something that I think we need to bottom out and be clear about in what we ultimately issue.
Thanks, Todd. So I think where we get to on this discussion is, it is about what meets the definition of a binding arrangement from the accounting perspective, and that enforceability is a key part of that. And it is the ability to enforce, not probability. And staff will come back with a paper just to clarify what the accounting consequence of the ability versus probability is, and it's a measurement impairment issue that we need to just pick apart a bit more so that we're clear on that consequence and we can be clear for our stakeholders, because as has been said, this has certainly been a problem in the past, and I think it's come back in the comments as well. So back to Todd's point, that we're absolutely crystal clear about what we mean by a binding arrangement. If it's not a binding arrangement, then you would just recognise income or expenditure depending on which side you're actually on. Todd. Todd, did you want to come in?
I just wonder. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're breaking up a little bit, but go ahead anyway. Try.
Yeah, no, I'm told my internet's unstable across my screen at times, so it might be. But I just wonder whether it's helpful for people to think about binding arrangements as reasonably similar to contracts, really. So, we use the term binding arrangement because contracts doesn't work for every situation when you get into the public sector. But if you think about it sort of contract-like, then I think what we're talking about here does work. It might help to get us all on the same page to think about a few examples. And would be happy to have that discussion if it's going to help people, but it's not that all arrangements that are entered into in the public sector are going to be forced into an accounting treatment here. And if I think about a lot of the arrangements that are entered into in New Zealand, I don't think we're going to be into binding arrangements as we're articulating here and most of the transactions in the public sector in New Zealand. And so that's where it could be helpful to actually set a few examples and demonstrate why something is or isn't a binding arrangement to help the board be sort of aligned around what we're doing here.
Well, I think can we stick with principles at the moment, because we will come back and look at the examples to see whether we've got the right examples to clarify. But we need to keep moving on the principles at this stage. So that's really, if you like, in the way that we propose to sort of let's get the principles agreed by the end of the year, and then we can work through and make sure we've got the right examples coming through. I will take comments from Lindy and Mike, but then I want to move us on because we've not really got to the right point in the debate yet. All we've actually done is confirm ability, which we had already decided. So I will, okay, so Lindy, and then I want to go back into the example and move us to the crux of this debate.
Thank you. I mean, obviously accepting that we are defining a certain type of arrangements and we're being quite specific. But then I guess you wouldn't say that just because, well then, there could be other arrangements, there could be contracts or donor agreements where I'm just giving cash, right? But then it's not going to fall within this arrangement. But there could be present obligations, and then that we would have to look at a later stage. So I'm just, and it might not be appropriation. So it's fine if we're looking at this to say there's this two-way enforceability, and this is the accounting consequences. There could be contracts and it could be donations where there's clearly no two-way enforceability. And then there would be another accounting treatment. But I'm just worried that we think that because there's a contract between two parties, there's always two-way enforceability, because I don't think that's the case.
Well, can we have the arguments on contractual enforceability separately? Because I think, essentially in most cases, a contract is a two-way agreement. That's why you have a contract in the first place. So we can chase down all kinds of exceptions to anything, but let's just move ahead. And I think that the kind of analogy you made, Todd, is quite helpful in terms of just thinking it through, even if we've had to use binding arrangement. Okay, so with that, Eileen, take us back into the examples and we'll move forward, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we just went through one example scenario, and the second scenario that we have listed in the paper and that we're going to quickly summarize in the slides, because I recognize we were about 2 hours in, is on the flip side. So let's assume same simple case facts, that there are only 2 parties involved in the binding arrangement, but in this case, the transfer recipient is actually the first to fulfill their obligations. Now, while scenario 2 is less common, it still does occur in the public sector, where the resources are provided by the transfer provider after the transfer recipient has begun fulfilling its obligations. I'm just going to click through a bit more quickly here, because the first section is essentially the same, but once the transfer recipient has fulfilled its obligation, then it has the unfulfilled right and can exercise enforceability mechanisms to resolve the non-completion. Now, similarly, the transfer recipient can enforce in 2 ways, either by compelling the transfer provider to fulfill its stated obligation, i.e. transfer the resources promised, or to impose consequences because the transfer provider did not fulfill its stated obligations. Obviously, the ideal is to compel the transfer provider to fulfill and transfer the resources. And in this sense, the binding arrangement would be completed in essence. However, if the non-compliant party does not resolve its non-completion, then that party cannot avoid the consequences. So similarly, if we go back a step and they impose consequences, then the transfer provider would essentially have to, taking a step back, if the transfer provider cannot be compelled to fulfill its obligations in the binding arrangement, i.e. it does not transfer the promised goods, then the effective enforceability mechanism would enable the transfer recipient to impose consequences on the provider for its non-completion. And in this sense, it could be either providing some sort of penalty or even just a remittance of consideration. We went through a few examples in the paper, but as we've kind of noted in the session today, we're trying not to focus on too many examples, making them into rules, but really tying it back to a principle basis and looking at consequences as a whole. So stepping back and thinking about the scenario, it's the same sort of takeaway, if you will, where the enforceability mechanisms are enabling the transfer recipient to enforce its right to receive resources related to the obligations that they have fulfilled to date. And this holds the transfer provider accountable by imposing consequences if they do not complete their obligations. So if we take a step back and we think about the scenarios that we have listed, and we went into a bit more detail about this in the paper, there are essentially 2 types of results that come from an exercise of an enforceability mechanism. And that's either to compel completion of unfulfilled obligations or to impose consequences if they do not complete. Now, the paper listed several examples for illustrative and discussion purposes, and they're not meant to be an exhaustive list. So we just wanted to highlight again here that, as discussed in March as well, and is echoed in the discussions today, there's a lot of potential forms. They're going to depend by jurisdiction and also by binding arrangement based on the terms and conditions in those specific binding arrangements. So it'd be really difficult and not necessarily practical to try to create a prescriptive list of how or what types of results may occur once an enforceability mechanism is exercised. But what the key takeaways are is that on the compelled completion side, an effective enforceability mechanism would compel the extinguishment of non-compliance. Now, this by nature is not a consequence, but rather the enforceability would provide the entity with the ability and the power to hold the other parties accountable to fulfilling their responsibilities, which they agree to as willing parties when they enter into a binding arrangement. Now, in the cases when the party that is non-compliant does not resolve its non-completion of its obligations, then the enforceability of the binding arrangement would ensure that the non-compliant party cannot avoid the consequences of non-completion. Now, in the slide, we wanted to just highlight again various forms. could be explicit, could be implicit, but we just want to make sure that we present the principle appropriately. Now, one of the discussions we had in March, which we didn't quite wrap up, was about the right of return. And what staff has proposed in the paper based on our analysis is that right of return is a predominant but not a sole consequence, and they really will vary by jurisdiction and by binding arrangement. So similar to the assessment of what mechanisms of enforceability exist in a binding arrangement, which based on a March discussion meant that we have to consider all potential factors in the assessment, the entity should also consider how identified mechanisms of enforceability could impose consequences, and this again would vary by jurisdiction and by unique terms and conditions of the binding arrangement. Now, the guidance should be presented in a principle-based manner by referring to consequences imposed on the non-compliant parties, and this differs from the more explicit rule that we had in IPSAS 23. Now, as noted earlier in past board discussions, right of return is predominant, but not the sole consequence, and so we believe a principle-based approach is more appropriate here. This is just the last slide, Ian, before I get to the recommendations. So, as a summary of enforceability as a whole, binding arrangements are by definition enforceable at least on a two-way basis. And what we have identified today and also echoed in March was that enforceability and what consequences are imposed are not prescriptive. It's going to vary by jurisdiction and by binding arrangement, and thus professional judgment is going to be required. So what we're proposing as a summary and to include in the guidance as a single paragraph in the application guidance to clarify this concept is that an effective enforceability mechanism would impose consequences on parties that do not fulfill their obligations in the binding arrangement. And so an entity should consider all facts and circumstances of the respective arrangement in their jurisdiction in this assessment. Now, if the mechanism identified by the entities do not in substance enable the entity to hold the other party, involved party accountable in the cases of non-completion, then the arrangement is not in substance enforceable, and thus it's not a binding arrangement as defined in the proposed revenue standards. Instead, the transaction will be accounted for using ED 71 accounting guidance, which, as we've iterated today, will probably apply to the majority of revenue transactions in the public sector. So the recommendation here, we have listed two. The first is to confirm how enforceability is recognized is through the imposition of consequences on the parties that don't fulfill their obligations they agreed to in the binding arrangement. The second recommendation is specific to guidance that was proposed in 6.3.1 and also to include this additional guidance on the principle enforceability to further round out the overall principle in the final standards.
Thanks, Eileen. Okay, so open up for comments from members in terms of that proposed way forward. Mike.
So Eileen, thank you. I'm happy with what you're proposing. I just wanted though, I'm looking at paragraph 2 of your paper 6.2.3, confirm that enforceability imposes implicit or maybe it should say the ability to impose, to be consistent, because we've now said it's the ability that's important. It's not the fact that they do impose, but it's the ability to impose.
Eileen, do you want to come back?
That makes sense, and I think it would help to reinforce that ability is what we want to focus on, so we can definitely make that revision.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other hands raised, so I think we agree with the staff recommendations, subject to that change that Mike has just identified. Okay, Lynn.
Sorry, I just did have a question mark about implicit and explicit and whether or not we need to even use both, just say that, just use consequences. I just queried whether or not implicit might take people wider than you intend.
Eileen?
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Chair. So in terms of implicit and explicit, the reason we included it is kind of similar to when we think about written and oral terms within a binding arrangement as well, because in some jurisdictions, it's not necessarily explicitly written into a binding arrangement as a term or condition, but it is generally known without being written. And so in those cases, we wanted to at least include one mention of it, say, for example, an application guidance or non-authoritative guidance that as part of the overall assessment, the entity should consider explicit and potentially implicit consequences. But implicit consequences don't necessarily override explicit, and explicit don't necessarily override implicit. But it's sort of just making sure they have the full picture of considerations in then doing their assessment on enforceability overall. So I think and maybe the takeaway, and we can consider this further, is where we make that mention and try not to create confusion depending on where we put that piece of guidance.
I mean, it sounds just like that it would be helpful not to make that specific mention there, but it would be worthwhile actually essentially summarizing what you've just said somewhere, so that you know, that we give that guidance. So Lynn, I think that would, if we take that approach, that would help and address your point. Okay. Good. Okay, so Eileen, if you can take that away, but subject to that and the change to the ability, we agree with the staff recommendations. Okay, so we move on to 6.2.4, I think, is that right? Yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry, I just saw Mike raise his hand, so.
Are you okay, Mike, if we can move on, please?
I just wanted to check, when do we come back to the definition of binding arrangement? We've had the conversation about enforceability.
We need to do the next thing, I think.
Okay.
And then we'll come back. I haven't forgotten. Okay, right. So we move on to 6.2.4. Is this you, John, or is this Eileen?
So I'm going to kick off with the first slide to kind of go through the tie out, if you will, about why we're presenting a conceptual framework paper in the overall revenue and transfer expense session. And then I'll pass it off to John to go into the details of the paper.
Great, thanks, Eileen.
No problem. Okay, hopefully that's shared.
Yep.
So this is the fourth paper in the overall package. And as mentioned at the beginning of the session, this paper, as well as the enforceability paper we just presented, are intended to help us move along the overall discussion of whether there is a liability from a binding arrangement without a performance obligation. And now in March, some constituents had noted, and we discussed as a board, that some constituents found it was an unclear basis for recognizing a liability. And in that discussion, the board had noted that potentially it's the term outflow of resources that is causing some of the lack of clarity. And some of the constituents have also noted that they don't quite know what an outflow entails. Now, outflow of resources is specifically in the current definition of a liability as proposed in the conceptual framework. Now, we found that this was a useful tie-out to the current conceptual framework limited scope update, because the board is currently in the process of updating the framework. And one of the key issues is the definition of a liability, as well as definition of an asset, where we will consider the IASB's definition, which they proposed in the revised 2018 conceptual framework. So this current paper has been prepared and presented to review the definition of a liability, and in particular, what is the meaning and the use of the term outflow of resources. So I'll pass it over to John.
Yeah, hello everybody, and good to be here. Many thanks to Eileen for the introduction and for also the work on the joint paper and the slides. Eileen's knowledge of the revenue project has made an abstract subject, I think, a little bit more lively and relevant. Eileen is going to forward the slides because of the pickle I got into in March. So thanks to Eileen for that. The current definition of a liability in the IPSASB framework is similar to the definition in the IASB's 2010 conceptual framework, in as much as it contains 3 components, and those components are coloured green, red, and blue on the slide. So we've got a present obligation for an outflow of resources resulting from a past event. Now, I'm not going to talk about the expected to result aspect of the IASB framework, because I'll deal with that in much more detail in September. But those 3 components are all there. What we have missing from our framework is that we don't actually explain what an outflow of resources involves. There's very limited guidance. Basically, the framework our framework restricts itself to saying, well, you've got to have an outflow of resources, and if you don't have an outflow of resources, then you don't have a liability. In this respect, if we could move on the slides, the IASB's revised definition and guidance in 2018 is quite helpful. The first thing to note about the IASB's 2018 definition of a liability is that it does not use the term outflow of resources. It replaces that term with transfer of an economic resource. Why was that? Well, the IASB felt that interpretations of the terms outflow and inflow can vary widely, and also importantly, that those terms are often tied to a notion of a threshold level of probability. The IASB removed the threshold level of probability in its 2018 framework. Our framework never actually included such a threshold. The IASB adopted the view that the wording change is a clarification. It's not a substantive change in the underlying concepts, and the IASB conducted testing of the revised definitions and concluded that they don't result in inconsistency with IFRS standards level detail. Staff consider that the rationale for wording change to clarify the underlying concepts is also applicable and appropriate for the public sector, and that such a clarification in the IPSASB framework would not involve a substantive change. And a further point to note is that the IASB uses the term economic resource. We talk about resources without prefixing them with economic. And the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, in 2014, when the IPSASB finalized the framework, the IPSASB took the view that a resource is automatically economic. And we also did not want to produce uncertainty that a resource includes the ability to provide services. In other words, service potential. And I'll be addressing service potential in a little bit more detail tomorrow. So let's move on and consider some of the additional guidance and the examples that the IASB gave in its 2018 framework that Eileen and I think will help clarify the concepts underlying the definition of a liability, and therefore would be helpful to include in our IPSASB conceptual framework. First of all, the obligation must have the potential to require the entity to transfer a resource to another party. Secondly, and I think this is important in the concept of revenue and transfer expenses, the liability entails an incremental transfer of resources as a result of a past event. In other words, using the ISB's wording on the left-hand column, it's transfer of an economic resource that it would not otherwise have had to transfer in the ordinary course of activities. And I think that point, in terms of the discussions that we've had on revenue and transfer expenses, is very helpful. I certainly started to understand things a little bit more clearly when I looked at it in the as an incremental transfer, and thanks to Edwin for his help on that. The transfer of economic resources can be in various forms. And lastly, the ISB framework does acknowledge that liabilities can be fulfilled without transferring resources to a counterparty. And this needs to be assessed at each reporting period. So you can negotiate a release with the counterparty. You can transfer that liability to a third party, or you can replace it with a new transaction. And just to go back and to clarify some of the examples of how an obligation can be fulfilled, can be by paying cash, by delivering goods or providing services, by making a transfer based on uncertain future events, or exchanging resources on unfavorable terms. Okay, so we think that giving some further examples, whether or not we adopt the terminology transfer of resources or retain outflow of resources, will actually be extremely helpful in clarifying what an outflow of resources or a transfer of resources actually involves. So to end up, the staff recommendations. Firstly, we think that the definition of a liability in the IPSASB's conceptual framework should be clarified by, firstly, revising the definition of a liability to replace the wording outflow of resources with transfer of resources, drawn from but not completely congruent with the ISB's 2018 conceptual framework. Secondly, consistent with the last slide, we think that there should be additional guidance and examples on what a transfer of resources actually is, and complement this with a paragraph in the basis for conclusion that the wording change is a clarification rather than a substantive modification of the framework. Dependent upon the discussion which will ensue over the next few minutes, we will incorporate this additional clarity and guidance on the definition of a liability into the discussion of the existence of a liability in the revenue project in September 2021. And at the same time, we'll bring forward proposed wording changes to the framework in the context of a revision of Chapter 5 of the framework chapter dealing with elements, also in September 2021. And at that point, I'll ask Eileen if Eileen has anything further to add and return to Ian as chair. So thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. Eileen, anything else to add to that? So thank you very much both for that presentation. think that's a very good setup for discussion, and open up for comments from members on that proposal. So Ajith, you had your hand up first, and then Kamira.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ian. I just want to ask a question from John.
Yeah.
I would like to have a little bit of clarification as to how this new wording relates with the concept of contingent liability.
Sorry, Ajith, relates to a contractual liability.
Sorry, contingent liability.
Contingent liability. I don't think there would be any changes in its relationship with a contingent liability. Now, we'll get to this in September because our framework is currently consistent with the ISB framework in that it doesn't include a probability threshold in the definition of a liability. The contingent liabilities are addressed at standards level in IPSAS 19 and for the ISB in IAS 37. Now, some have argued that because under the definitions of a liability in both our framework and the ISB framework, that a contingent liability would no longer have substance because you would take account of the measurement aspects of a contingent liability in measurement, and therefore a contingent liability would potentially no longer exist. Now, neither the ISB nor the IPSASB have actually revised IAS 37 or IPSAS 19 to reflect that particular discussion. And it is something that we would need to consider potentially at some point in the future. But this wording change that I have suggested, I don't think has any material impact on that particular issue as to whether or not a contingent liability any longer has substance. I hope that's clear. Basically, it's an issue that I think it's fair to say that both the ISB and the IPSASB has swerved, that neither standard setter has proposed changes to their standards, their standard dealing with provisions, contingent liabilities and contingent assets to align with the framework.
Thanks, John. Okay, go to Kamira and then to Mike.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, John, for the presentation. I have two questions. So the first question is if this change to the definition will also imply that we will remove this sentence from the conceptual framework that stated that an obligation that can be settled without an outflow of resources from the entity is not a liability. So does it mean that we will remove also even, or we will adapt this sentence to saying that an obligation that cannot be settled without a transfer of resources is not a liability? Because you already provided some examples that there are situations in which we can settle a liability without a transfer of resources. And I know that this sentence is quite important because it raises also issues for the leases project and others. So I would like to know what is the implication of this change with this sentence. And my second question, if you could explain a bit more this new emphasis that will be given in the incremental, emphasizing the incremental transfer of resources, because it was not too clear for me.
Okay.
So thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, on the first issue, yes, there would be consequentials. Now, my initial view is that we would be replacing references to an outflow of resources with a transfer of resources. I think that, yes, I did say that there are occasions which the ISB acknowledge that a present obligation need not be fulfilled. There are other ways of discharging it. And I think those ways do directly or indirectly involve a transfer of resources, but they don't necessarily involve fulfilling the obligation in accordance with the specified way. So all I think the ISB is doing there is just recognizing that you can actually, in certain circumstances, negotiate a release with the counterparty. You can actually get a third party to assume the obligation. Now, in both those cases, there will be a transfer of resources, but it may not be a transfer of resources in accordance with the binding arrangement or other arrangement when you initially recognize the liability. So I think the idea is that until the point in which you have actually negotiated a release with a counterparty or a third party's assumed the liability, you still do have a liability and an assumption that there will, or rather that you have an assumption that there will be a transfer of resources and that that liability will be discharged in accordance with the binding arrangement. So I think all the ISB is doing there is recognizing some atypical circumstances. Sorry, Kamira, your second point, just...
Yes, was to just clarify a bit more about this emphasis on the incremental
right.
transfer of resources.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back. Yeah, what the ISB says is they've inserted guidance. Eileen, is it possible to go back to slide 19 on this? Because it would be helpful actually to highlight the wording. Yeah, what we've got there is the second bullet point. So we've got all the three components of a liability: the present obligation, the past event, the transfer of an economic resource. But we've got the introduction of that underlying wording that it would not otherwise have had to transfer. Now, I think the thinking behind this, and thinking which is very helpful in the public sector context, is if you are simply going to take a course of action as part of your everyday activities, then you would not have a liability. So if it's an ongoing activity of government that you are going to carry out regardless of any arrangement with a counterparty, then it's questionable whether or not there is an outflow of resources. So that's what we mean by an incremental transfer of resources as a result of a past event. I hope that's clear, Kamira. I mean, I would also add that I think that this does require judgment on the part of the entity. But if we think about this in the context of what we call individual and collective services.
Can I move on, because we're running out of time?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think Kamira's content with the answer to her original point. So I want to go
that's
Mike,
fine.
And then Renee, and then Lucy.
Could I just, Ian, highlight paragraph 13 before we move on? Paragraph 13 of the agenda paper. Okay, thank you.
Mike?
Oh, sorry, I thought John was going to say something.
No.
Okay, my apologies. So I've got, thank you. I've got a couple of observations and a couple of questions, John. So thank you for you and Eileen. So it was trying to get clear in my own mind the difference between a binding arrangement and a binding obligation. And if we're going to make changes to the definition, which I support, I'm happy with the change in the definition. We need to look, I think, at paragraphs 523, BC 530 and BC 533 of the framework to make sure that they now are in line with what you're proposing. So, yeah, I'm happy to work with John offline to make sure we get those paragraphs right, because I think they're affected by this question about, is there a realistic opportunity to avoid an obligation or not? And I want to make sure we get the right distinction between a binding obligation and a binding arrangement.
Okay.
When I read your proposed solution to this, John, I got the impression, I'm not sure if this is the intent or not, but if we have a binding arrangement and we have a new definition of a binding arrangement, and that's 9 times out of 10, I think, in the result in the resource recipient recording a liability, even though we don't have a performance obligation. So what was the whole point of the performance obligation discussion we had if every binding arrangement is always going to result in a liability, even if the binding arrangement isn't terribly specific? So I'm not sure now, was that the intent, or is that where we're just going to end up? Because if every binding arrangement means that the resource recipient has a liability, then we need to be clear about that. And I'm not sure that was always the intent.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, the other last thing from me, Ian, was
Mike, can we not worry about performance versus present obligations? The idea is we're having the debate in terms of present obligations at this stage. There may or may not be an impact on that later.
Yeah, I suppose then my question is, the outcome, am I right in reading that the outcome of every single binding arrangement, because there's obligations on both parties, regardless of how specific or unspecific that arrangement might be, we're going to end up with the resource recipient booking a liability? And if that's the case, is that what we intended?
Well, in the conceptual framework, present obligations arise from legal obligations and what we've called non-legally binding obligations. The revenue project is basically dealing with legal obligations, not non-legally binding obligations. Paragraph 5.23 that you've highlighted deals with non-legally binding obligations. And that's the term that the board adopted in 2014 for what had previously been known and continued to be known in IFRS literature as constructive obligations.
Okay.
Now, if you ask me my honest opinion, I don't think that the adoption of that term non-legally binding obligation has actually provided the clarification which it was intended to provide. But nevertheless, that is where we are. So the section of the framework which deals with legal obligations, it's paragraphs 520 to 522. But I do agree that the use of binding does create some uncertainties.
Okay, so thank you. So I think it's important that we look at all those paragraphs again. And my last question was, is it okay for us to be, as part of the limited scope update of the conceptual framework, to be making these changes or possible changes, when we haven't finalised a standard on revenue? I mean, I'm okay that we are, because I think we're just playing with words here, but I just want to make sure that's okay.
Well, I think that's a process point, Mike. I mean, basically, if we're content that we should make the changes to the framework, then we can propose those changes and then bring those in when we finalise the standard.
Yeah. I mean, the line of travel I've always felt should be that the concepts underpin the development of standards level literature. But as we're aware, and as we're demonstrating here, the way in which the framework is interpreted, does indicate that it's a two-way relationship as well. And in this instance, we looked at the framework discussion of a present obligation and an outflow of resources, and their paragraphs 5.15 and 5.16 of the framework. And basically, we've dealt with these two components in two very short paragraphs. You know, we came to the view that we really need more guidance here. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And I think thanks to the offer Mike to work the detail through, which we can do for September. So we're on the principle of, do we make the change here? And then we'll see the drafting in September if the board is content with that. Renee, you've been waiting patiently.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm very comfortable with the proposals. In substance, it makes a lot of sense. I was just thinking, and I think Ian, you just addressed this. Is this going to be part of the limited scope conceptual framework amendment proposal? That's where it's going to reside, not in this. Okay, thank you. I wanted to clarify.
Well, there would be consequences then in terms of the guidance and the revenue standard, obviously, but you know, we'll be dealing with the two in parallel in September is the idea if the board's content with that. So we have consistency. Okay, Lucy and then Lynn.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Of course, we will be discussing this in September, but my concern is actually on paragraph 4.38 of the IPSASB framework, wherein it says that an obligation can meet the definition of a liability even if the probability of a transfer of an economic resource is low. I don't know how this can be possible or operational in public sector entities. Like, for instance, if the transfer provider is not assured of the appropriation that for a particular to cover a particular binding arrangement. So I think this has, well, we can look at this when we decide on whether we would be adopting the new definition of liability under the IPSASB framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And I'll go to Lynn and then back to John.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the exchange between Mike and John around the term non-legally binding obligations, and I would encourage staff to perhaps reflect on whether or not you might want to bring a proposed change to make that constructive obligations. I do think the term non-legally binding could cause confusion about binding arrangements or not, and if we don't mean binding arrangements, I think it would be helpful to drop the term here, and we have an opportunity to do so, so why wouldn't we?
Thanks, Lynn. Ross, did you want to come in before I go back to John?
Yeah, not on that point. I just had an email from Scott who had to drop off, and I wanted to register that he was supportive of the definition today, inclusion of enforceability, and where we're going on this. So I just thought I should read in his support as well, because he can't be here.
Okay, thanks. John, back to you.
Yeah, on Lucy's point, Lucy, this was a consequence of the IPSASB adopting an approach which had been discussed with the ISB, but wasn't in their conceptual framework at the time that we approved the IPSASB conceptual framework. In other words, that threshold in the definition of a liability was in the 2010 ISB framework, but we did not include it in our framework. Now, we didn't do that in isolation, because the ISB had signaled both in a discussion paper and in staff discussions with us that they were going to remove that probability threshold. So paragraph 4.38 of the ISB framework, and I'm going to read this to give the context. The ISB say an obligation can meet the definition of a liability, even if the probability of transfer of an economic resource is low. Nevertheless, that low probability might affect decisions about what information to provide about the liability and how to provide that information. Now, this is a major difference between our framework and the standards level definitions of assets and liabilities in IPSAS 1. And that is exactly the same as in the ISB literature. So we do not include probability thresholds within the definition of a liability or an asset. The consequence of that, if you take application of the framework to a logical conclusion, is that decisions, consequences on probability are taken into account in the measurement process, not in establishing whether or not you have an asset or a liability. I think I've had discussions with a number of people on this, and there are differing of views, and I frequently talked about it with a former chair of the IPSASB who thinks that there still should be probability thresholds within the definitions of elements. But where we are at the moment is that we are consistent fully with the ISB. I hope that's reasonably clear. It's a bit of a difficult point to get across. Going to Lynn's point, I've got, I don't think that the project brief has actually said that we're going to specifically look at the notion of a non-legally binding obligation. So perhaps this is something that I can discuss with staff chair, deputy chair offline, but I tend to agree with Lynn that I don't actually think that this term non-legally binding obligation has worked very well. And I think some of the ambiguities in it have actually begun to be seen more clearly when we've used the framework for project development. You know, just to add a little bit more colour to this, I think some of us felt that using a term non-legally binding obligation would be helpful to those who weren't in an Anglo-Saxon legal framework and to non-English speakers, but I don't think it's worked.
Well, can we not go back into that at this stage, John, because there was a long debate backwards and forwards on that when we did the original framework. So I think let's not bite off more than we need to here. Let's deal with the bit that we need to for revenue, which was actually the outflow of resources point, not non-legally binding, because we'll be right back into a Christchurch earthquake and all kinds of stuff like that before we know where we are. So can I go to you, Lindy, please?
Thank you. I guess the first point is like quite stupid that thought let me raise it in any case. And maybe it's a caution in how we put the wording in, because transfer in our literature has quite a specific connotation. You know, we've used transfer expenses and now we're having a transfer of resources. So we just have to be clear how we explain this, not to mean that this is now just a non-exchange type of arrangement, because you know, it's kind of quite embedded in our literature, which is not in the IASB's literature the same with the same type of meaning. And I guess then, I guess it's also just then around the whole communication around this, because I don't want it to look like, oh, we're changing the conceptual framework because we're struggling with revenue. And I suppose we're going to look at the asset definition as well. So I'm just worried about the perception that it's creating, that we're changing a non-authoritative guidance because we're struggling with principles in the standards. So I guess the communication around that and the timing would be quite important. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think though, you know, what we're doing is we're actually testing the framework in practice here. And, you know, as we've had with measurement, actually, if it proves that either we've had problems in application in practice or ideas have been superseded, then there's nothing that stops us changing the framework. And I think what our constituents have raised with us is there is a problem with this phrase outflow of resources, and ISB has already had that problem as well. So what they've done is to propose a change to address that. And I think that's the way that we do it. You know, it does help in terms of the challenge that we're facing with revenue, but that's a real practical problem. So I think we just need to be careful, but actually, you know, partly we're fixing a problem that exists in the framework anyhow that another standard setter has found. So, you know, and it helps us in terms of some of the challenges that people are finding here. So I think we can deal with the communication, but I think the point is actually it helps. Now on the transfer point, I think, you know, John, have a look at that, but I think what we, you know, I mean, we use the term transfer as a noun, as a name. Here we're talking about to transfer verbs. So I think, again, we just need to be careful about overthinking this. And again, it may be in the explanation, but if you can take that away and have a look at it. And I think, you know, clearly the board will need to have a look at the wording, and that was really why we wanted to have the debate conceptually here before bringing back the drafting, and that would be drafting both for the revenue standard but also for the conceptual framework. So I'm sort of conscious of time. I'm sort of seeing that the board obviously does want to see the drafting, but in terms of the principle of the changes in the framework, terminology and then additional guidance, that seems to be supported. And then similarly, we will need to see the consequences in terms of revenue. If that's okay, then I'd like to go back to Mike's point earlier, which is we do need to address this phraseology point in terms of, are we going to talk about legal and equivalent means, and then what's the consequence for the binding arrangement definition. Eileen, perhaps if I can just go back to you on that binding or equivalent, sorry, legal or equivalent means point.
Yeah, happy to provide some thoughts, Ian, and thanks, Mike, for bringing up this topic. So right now the definition doesn't include legal or equivalent means, and as part of a follow through from an offline discussion we had with another member, we did go back and just double check of the proposed guidance, how often do we mention legal or equivalent means? Right now, we only have one mention in the core text and maybe about 3 to 5 different mentions in application guidance just to kind of help clarify the concept. And I think where we're kind of landing is, you know, enforceability, we are saying it has to be through legal or equivalent means, but it would be a clarification to that overall principle. And if we kind of follow through with the way we have essentially identified where we locate guidance, then it might be still more appropriate to have in application guidance. But I'm happy to hear if there are any other thoughts on, you know, where it makes sense, given that we try to focus on putting principles only in the core text and those clarifications and elaborations in other parts of the standard.
And Eileen, that's then that's reinforcing the point that we're talking about legal rather than non-legally binding. Yeah. Mike, back on that.
Yeah, so thanks, Chair. I hear what you say, Eileen. Well, the conversation we had a few moments ago about what does enforceable mean, I think reinforces in my own mind even more important why we should actually deal with it in the definition. It's a bit hard, Ian, to read it out, but maybe if somebody can put it up on the screen, or we'll come back to it tomorrow night or whatever, I don't mind. But I think we need to be clear about what the word enforceable means in the definition of a binding arrangement. And I think we can do that easily by just spelling it out.
But Mike, back to you. Do we actually need to make this complexity? Because we have actually, you know, we've included guidance now on enforceable. So I don't see that we need to elaborate the wording in the definition if we've actually included the guidance elsewhere.
So then go back to this question about the discussion we had about what does legal or equivalent means mean, and then when is it not a legal or equivalent arrangement. That's why I thought putting the words in there would be, you know, enforceable by legal or equivalent means. It would make it clear to a reader just what it is we're getting at. So a binding arrangement only applies if it's enforceable by legal or equivalent means. Yeah, I just think it makes it actually explicit what we're getting at. Yeah, but I don't want. I'm not going to push this. I'm the only one who's pushing it.
Lynn.
Yeah, I do agree with Mike, and I do think by including it, it will really help our constituents reinforce, particularly on the transfer expenses side, when they are here versus when they are in constructive obligations.
Okay, so does anybody else, do I hear anybody that wants to argue against the proposed change from Mike and Lynn? Okay, so we'll take that as agreement then. Eileen, back to you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Mike and Lynn, for the intervention. I just wanted to clarify to make sure I understand kind of the ask here. In 6.3.1 on the second page, I guess, of that agenda item, right now the definition itself is obviously the first row. It doesn't include legal or equivalent means exactly in the definition, but about 2 paragraphs down, as part of the definition section of the core text, we do have a paragraph there where we are explicitly saying that for an arrangement to be binding, it must be enforceable through legal or equivalent means. So is the preference right now that's being highlighted to actually almost absorb that part into the definition itself rather than as a separate paragraph, just like the 2 paragraphs down as currently presented? That'll just help me to understand kind of what changes we might be looking for to bring back next time. So I see Ross has his hand up too.
Yeah, Ross, if you want to come in.
Yeah, I think that's the proposal Mike's making. So he sent us an email as well that you probably can't monitor because you're running the session, Eileen. But I think that's what it is, just elevating that from a couple bullets below and bringing it right into the definition.
Yeah. So I think that's right. I think it would just be helpful to, you know, I mean, obviously we'll have that in the decision. I guess do we include that, Ross, in the decisions and instructions, or how do we? I think we just need to make sure that we see that wording back.
Yeah, I think that's, if the board members are in agreement, I think that's a decision subject to drafting. Yeah. So that we're actually going to bring that into the definition itself, and the board will review the drafting to make sure they're comfortable. So we won't debate whether it's in or out, but how we craft that definition with it.
Yep. Okay, and I'm seeing thumbs up to that. Good. Okay. So I think with that, Eileen, from staff perspective, anything else that you need to cover off with us today?
No, that's it. But big thank you to the board for the useful discussions today. It's really helped us as a team to move the projects forward and round out some of the concepts. So very appreciated. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Mike.
Yeah, look, a big thank you from all of us, I think, because the presentations were first class. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for endorsing that. I think presentations have been extremely good this morning, but I think also it's been a very good discussion amongst the board as well. And I think you know, we've got to where I hoped from a board perspective we would get, that we needed to go through those concepts in more detail to get us onto the same page and to move this forward. So I think it's been well worthwhile the investment of time. So thanks everyone for a good morning's work, I think. Well, sorry, good morning here in the UK, good evening, good night, as it were, in New Zealand and Australia, and afternoon elsewhere, etc. So thanks everyone for today. I think we wrap up at that point, and we will come back tomorrow. And in accordance with the change in the agenda, we will be looking at the accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans first tomorrow before we move into the conceptual framework. Anything before we go, or maybe Leah could just tell us tomorrow morning about the arrangements, because we have got the social event at the end of tomorrow's session. So I don't know if there's anything that needs saying on that today, or whether we can deal with that before we start tomorrow.
I think the only thing, Ian, is that we encourage everybody to stay. It'll be similar to what we had in the December meeting, with the smaller breakout rooms, with people being able to move between the rooms. And we would encourage the observers and technical advisors to turn on their cameras and microphones and participate as well. So we hope to see everybody stay on for that.
That's great. Thanks, Leah, and absolutely endorse that. We really do want to see you and say hi and so on. We recognise that the virtual environment is very hard on TAs and observers. So we really do want you to at least be able to participate in the social side, even if it's only virtual. Mike, very final point, because I want to wrap us up.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm the decisions and instructions that Ross referred to. We won't get to see them until well after the meeting, Ross, is that right?
Ross, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, so reflecting on the last meeting and some of the concerns with circulating them in meeting and pulling them together, we've taken it off the agenda for the last day to review. We didn't find the sessions were going very smoothly, and it's quite a stress staff to turn those around mid-meeting. So what we're going to do, and I was going to talk about this on Tuesday, we're in the process of drafting decisions and instructions. We'll be clearing them with task force chairs as we normally do by the end of the meeting. And then within a day or two after the meeting, I expect to send them out to members for comment on any substantive points they want to raise. I think the key is the decisions and instructions are really just trying to capture, Ian's summaries after the discussions and where we're going on things. And the final day discussion was turning into a redeliberation of issues. And I don't think that's very helpful for staff or for board. So that's why we've taken it off the Tuesday agenda.
Thanks, but Mike, the intention is that you'll have them quickly and there will be limited time to turn them around and get the comments back, because the whole point is it was taking ages to get the much more verbatim minutes out, and we want to make sure that those decisions and instructions are available and staff can start working to implement. So it'll be a quick process, but just not some meeting. Great, everyone. Well, thanks very much for a good day, and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Okay, cheers.
Thanks everybody.